Welcome, welcome, welcome. NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, has declared May 14 to 18 to be Legislative Staff Week. With that in mind, I thought it might be interesting to take a look back at the history of legislative staffing in Tennessee. For those of you who don't know me, I am Eddie Weeks, your legislative librarian. Your legislative library is just down the hall here in Suite 804. Please stop by and say hi at any time. I'm there to answer just about any historical question you might have about the legislature, about old laws, about past legislators, about the legislative process, and even what is the history of legislative staffing in Tennessee. Well, if you take some time and think about it, you might think about the first General Assembly of the state of Tennessee. Yep, 1796. The first General Assembly of the state of Tennessee. Did they have staff then? They did. March 28th, 1796, the members of the House met and selected their first employee, Thomas H. Williams, Clerk of the House. That's the beginning. The first legislative employee, the Clerk of the House of Representatives. The next day in the Senate, March 29th, 1796, the first Senate employees, Francis A. Ramsey, Clerk, Nathaniel Buckingham, Assistant Clerk, and Thomas Bounds, Doorkeeper. Remember, though, these first legislative staffers were appointed 2 months before Tennessee became a state. The first General Assembly met in March 1796, but Tennessee didn't become a state until June the 1st, 1796. So the history of legislative staffing is older than the state itself. That first General Assembly was made up of 11 senators, one from each of Tennessee's 11 counties, 22 representatives, 2 from each of the counties. The elections were held on the second Thursday of March, 1796. The members met in Knoxville, the capital of the soon-to-be state. And someone was there before then to set everything up and get everything ready for the members of the legislature to meet. Those men who were selected to those positions didn't just walk in off the street. The history of legislative staffing in Tennessee is older than the state and is older than the General Assembly itself. In 1796, Tennessee's capital was Knoxville. Knoxville served as the capital until 1807, when Kingston was named the new capital of the state. The General Assembly met in Kingston for 1 day and passed one act that said Knoxville was again the capital of the state. But there were legislative staff in Kingston for its 1 day as capital. Knoxville remained the capital for the next 5 years until 1812, when Nashville was named the new capital of the state. Nashville was the capital for the next 3 years because in 1815 Knoxville was again named the capital and remained the capital until 1817, when Murfreesboro was named the new capital of the state and remained the capital for nearly a decade because in 1826 Nashville was again named the capital of the state and remained the capital until 1840, when the 23rd General Assembly names Murfreesboro as the new capital as of 1841. But the current governor is James K. Polk. The incoming governor is James Jones. They're both Nashvillians. They don't want to go to Murfreesboro, so the General Assembly reconsiders and leaves the capital in Nashville until 1843, when they decide to move again. In 1843, the legislature charges itself with naming a permanent capital of the state. They finally decide they're tired of moving. In the true spirit of legislative unity that exists to this day and that we're all so familiar with, the House chooses Murfreesboro and the Senate chooses Kingston. Nashville eventually became the compromise and the permanent capital of the state. The first order of business, though, was building a Capitol building. Prior to this point, when the General Assembly was meeting in Nashville, they met at the old Davidson County Courthouse or at Masonic Hall on Church Street between 4th and 5th Avenue, or anywhere there was enough room for the now 75 members of the House and 25 members of the Senate to meet. And wherever they met, they were staffed by the clerks. But now, with a permanent capital city, they needed a permanent Capitol building. The Building Commission is selected by the legislature, their legislative employees. Their chair is Samuel Dold Morgan. They select a rather famous young architect, William Strickland, to design the new building. He gave them a grand design. It's based on a Greek Ionic temple, 270 feet across the front, 140 feet on the sides, 198 feet from the top of the hill to the top of the roof, and then the cupola on top of that. It's a design that's been copied by many people in many different ways. And there were legislative staff in that building. For example, 1891 House Resolution 29 directed the Sergeant-at-Arms to purchase brooms, dusters, water buckets, and slop pans for the use of the House. Now, while these may have been for the use of the House, we can be pretty certain it was not the members who were using these items. And I have checked with Robert Robertson. We no longer have legislative slop pans in supply. But what's important to remember is that all branches of state government were united together into this one grand building. The original ground floor with the two separate crypts. The first floor with the governor's office, the Secretary of State, the courts of the state, and other executive branch offices. And on the top floor, the legislative branch of government, with the House chamber, the Senate chamber. What there was not, though, anywhere in the building were any legislative staff offices. The rooms surrounding the House chamber were the committee rooms for the legislature. What there was, though, was a library. 1854, House Joint Resolution 4, that the Secretary of State be, and he is hereby instructed to collect all of the books belonging to the state and have them in his office in the Capitol as soon as possible for the use of the legislature. For the use of the legislature. The librarian was a legislative employee. From 1855 on, the members and staff of the General Assembly have had their own library for research, for reference, and for history. And there have been some scandals involving that library, those librarians, and that spiral staircase. You see, in 1871, Mrs. Paralee Haskell became the first female librarian of the state. And when she went up and down that staircase, you could see her ankles from anywhere in the room. She was not the only one. The next 8 legislative librarians were all women, from 1871 until 1919, mostly serving 2- or 4-year terms. But how do you protect the modesty and the ankles of those librarians? The solution was to put up a modesty curtain all around the staircase. So, if you've ever seen a picture of the staircase with bunting all the way around it, you now know the reason why: to shield the librarian's ankles from prying eyes. And now you know my great secret, why I wear boots at work so that no one can question the modesty of my ankles. Mrs. Paralee Haskell, the first female librarian of the legislature, was not the first female employee of the legislature. That honor goes to Mrs. Margaret Vanoy Brown of the Senate, who in 1871 was elected the first female engrossing clerk of the Senate. On October 5th, 1871, the newspaper, the Sweetwater Enterprise, reported on her election and editorialized, "What do you think of the Senate electing a woman engrossing clerk?" The suffragettes of the state were certainly happy with the situation. I am sorry to see her accept the position. I fear we will see many more female applicants for clerkships and other offices. In 1873, Mrs. Brown was defeated in her bid to again be elected engrossing clerk. But in 1875, Miss Emily Peyton was elected to that position. In 1877 and 1879, Mrs. Eliza G. Cook was elected the Senate engrossing clerk. And in 1881, she was again re-elected to that position, while Mrs. Molly Grizzard became the first elected female engrossing clerk in the House. Just as a point of comparison, it was not until 2017 that either house appointed its first female chief clerk, over 100 years after its first female engrossing clerk. These first female legislative staffers, though, faced many problems, not just their ankles. The main problem being they were actually prohibited from holding those offices. As the Supreme Court of Tennessee explained in 1893 in the case of State v. Davidson, by the English or common law, no woman beneath the dignity of a queen could take part in the government of the state, and they could hold no offices except parish offices. Although a woman may be a citizen, she is not entitled, by virtue of her citizenship, to take any part in the government, either as a voter or an officer, independent of some legislation conferring such rights upon her. In explaining the female librarian and the female clerks, the court said, "It is true that a woman fills the office of state librarian, and there is no act providing therefor, but she is elected directly by the legislature, which is equivalent to conferring upon her the power to hold the office." The 45th General Assembly responded with 1895 Chapter 5, declaring, "So as to provide that women shall be eligible to the office of librarian," 20 years after appointing a woman to that position. A little over 20 years after that, the General Assembly passed 1921, Public Chapter 95, that women are hereby made eligible to hold any public office in Tennessee. That situation lasted less than 20 years because 1935 House Resolution 18 declared it to be the policy of the state that from and after this date, no married woman shall be employed and paid by the state of Tennessee, and that it shall be mandatory for all such state officials who now have in their employ such married women to forthwith dispense with the services of such persons and fill their places with unmarried women. It was the height of the Great Depression, after all. These first female staff members also faced other problems, not the least of which was that there was only one toilet room in the entire Capitol building. It was on the ground floor, the basement or the crypt level, and was flushed by rainwater collected from the roof and kept in cisterns surrounding the crypt level. Remember that in these days, the General Assembly convened in October of the odd-numbered year and met in October, November, December, the driest months of the year. The system and the cisterns did not work so well. 1891 House Joint Resolution 3 stated that the cisterns are leaking badly and they are needing to be cleaned out and repaired so that the water supply for the closets will not be exhausted, and that this must be done before the spring rains cease, being the only source by which they are filled. The toilet room in the Capitol building was described in the 1886 report of the Board of Commissioners to supervise Capitol repairs, in the appendix to the 1887 Senate Journal, with perhaps the best prose ever in the history of the Senate Journal. the toilet room is described as a stench in the nostrils of decency that had been declared a nuisance, both by the State Board of Health and the city sanitary officer. Now, folks, I know that we sometimes deal with unpleasant situations, but our predecessors as legislative staff dealt with situations all their own. Don't you wish we had a record of these early staff members? We do. Or at least the State Librarian Archives has many of these records. The listings of the names, the positions, the amounts paid, duplicated in the appropriations bills for most of these years, like this 1854 example from the 30th General Assembly. Section 21, $228 for clerk hire. Section 24, $36 for 6 days as assistant clerk. And if you'll look closely, you'll see listings for payments to one person for the use of someone else. It's 1854. These are probably masters being paid for the services of their slaves. We know that by the early 1900s, there was some legislative staff space in the Capitol. 1919, Senate Resolution 30 mentions the room used by the engrossing clerks and directs the superintendent of the Capitol to find more room for these clerks. But what there was not in all these lists of staff or anywhere in that building were any personal staff for the legislature. Remember, the General Assembly at this time was still meeting every other year for just a few months. The Constitution of 1870 changed the convening time from October of the odd-numbered year to January of the odd-numbered year, but the tradition of only meeting every other year continued as it had since 1797. Remember that most of these members were here for just 1 or 2 terms, just for a few months and then gone. The Tennessee Constitution stated that they could only meet every other year for just 75 legislative days. They had no real need for full-time personal staff. As time went on, though, they did need research and other professional staff services. 1949, Chapter 192, created the Tennessee Legislative Reference Bureau. The thing was, the Legislative Reference Bureau was made up of members of the State Planning Commission, which was part of the executive branch. Executive branch employees doing the work for the legislative branch. This situation was discussed by Professor Henry N. Williams in the Tennessee Law Review in 1952. In his article, he states, "The present constitutional arrangement encourages the governor to secure such authority and appropriations from the legislature as he desires, and then to get the legislature adjourned and proceed to run the state for the remaining 21 months of his term without any fear of legislative interference. This condition is not conducive to the proper functioning of the legislature." Remember, the governor is limited to 2 consecutive 2-year terms. What we needed was a period of executive branch stability for the legislative branch to gain its own independence. After Governor Hill McAllister left office in 1937, Governor Browning came into office for 4 years, followed by Prentice Cooper for 4 years, over to Governor McCord for 4 years, back to Governor Browning for 4 more years, over to Governor Clement for 4 years, on to Governor Ellington for 4 years, back to Governor Clement for 4 more years, back to Governor Ellington, who shoots and scores. Wrong. These 5 men held the governor's office for 33 years, from before World War II to the beginnings of disco, giving the legislature the stability it needed to set out on its own. In 1953, the General Assembly created the Legislative Council Committee, replacing the Legislative Reference Bureau. It was composed of certain members of the legislature and certain legislative staff members. This council committee also had a unique power to meet while the legislature was not in session. They could meet in the even-numbered year after the legislature had adjourned sine die in the odd-numbered year. The staff members of this council also provided bill and resolution drafting services, as well as research and reference for members of the legislature. They had offices in the state capitol, and it was this council that recommended more staff and other improvements for the legislature. The 78th General Assembly responded with 1953 House Joint Resolution 1 to study the hiring of employees, procurement of working space for the members and committees, and all other matters which will improve the efficiency of the legislative branch of government. It was this council that met with members of the public and got their input on legislative matters. And it was this council that prepared the way for future staff of the General Assembly. Those of you who, like me, have 20-plus years of service to the legislature might recognize some of the names from this Legislative Council Committee. Jim Clodfelter, Bud Gangwer, Barbara Langley. That's the future Director of Legal Services and 2 future Directors of Legislative Services. And my immediate predecessor, Julie McCowan, Legislative Librarian. The home of these new legislative services was in the newly finished basement of the Capitol building, where the South Crypt used to be, and in the Legislative Lounge, the previous Legislative Library. In the late 1950s, legislators began taking office space in the War Memorial Building, a building that was never built to be legislative office space. It was built to house state government offices, but never designed for legislative offices. But legislative staff adapted it and made it work. Other legislative staff offices, including the Legislative Council Committee, moved from the Capitol to the War Memorial Building, producing one of the great photos of legislative action. You might be able to make out the word vodka and Bacardi. The caption reads, "The back door of a bar? No. These cartons, which at one time held alcoholic beverages, were stacked outside the Legislative Council offices of the ground floor of the Capitol. The boxes, all empty, were accumulated over several weeks for use in packing when the Council moves its offices to the War Memorial Building." 1966 saw the greatest change to the legislature since its creation back in 1796. That year, the people of the state approved a constitutional amendment. Beginning in 1968, the legislature met every year, convening in January of each year and limited to 90 legislative days over 2 years. Members of the legislature now needed full-time staff to stay in Nashville and keep their offices. By this time, there was a stenographic pool for the use of the legislators. If a member needed to have a memo or a letter typed, the member contacted the clerk's office, who then sent a stenographer to take dictation and type it up. It was these stenographers who were the first hires for the members' assistants. But don't think it was one assistant to one member. Think of the layout of the War Memorial Building. Standard was one assistant to 4 members of the legislature. And the legislature continued to grow. 1967, Public Chapter 12 created the Fiscal Review Committee and gave it staff. 1971, Public Chapter 11 created the Council on Pensions and Retirement and gave it staff. And the legislature needed more room. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a new building was built below the War Memorial Building, the Legislative Plaza. Committee rooms for the legislature, and more room for members and staff. By the late 1970s, the Legislative Council Committee had seen its time come and go. Its duties and responsibilities were simply too much for any one committee to handle. 1977 Public Chapter 89 split this council into multiple offices, including the Joint Legislative Services Committee, the Office of Legal Services, the Office of Legislative Services, and the Office of Legislative Administration. Also in 1977, the 90th General Assembly created the Office of Program Evaluation by Public Chapter 317. By this time, the number of staff was approaching the number of members of the legislature, and everyone needed a way of keeping up with everyone else. In 1981, Representative John Spence put forward the idea of a book listing all of the other people who worked for the legislature, which was then named The Other People Book. These books give us the names and the offices of those who came before us and let us look back and reminisce. Legislative Administration and the Fiscal Review Committee, the Office of Legal Services, and the Office of Legislative Services. Since those days in the early 1980s, 1981 Senate Joint Resolution 61 created the Office of Minority Affairs. 1987 Public Chapter 163 created the Office of Management Information Systems, currently known as Legislative Information Systems, our computer folk. And 1999, Public Chapter 497 created the Office of Legislative Budget Analysis. And all of these and a few others along the way were all housed in the War Memorial Building and the Legislative Plaza. And when we ran out of room in those, some offices moved over to the Rachel Jackson Building. The limits of those buildings were reached years ago. In 2017, the legislature and its legislative staff moved into a new home. The move was not always easy and not always smooth, but it was accomplished by dedicated and determined legislative staff. Like the previous legislative homes, this building was not originally designed for legislative office space. It was built in the 1950s for state government office space, but not for legislative office space. It housed many state departments over its history. One of the first agencies to move into this new building was the Department of Public Health. That means the state morgue was in this building. Also in this building were live sheep kept for research purposes, tuberculosis research. They were not necessarily live for long. While we may never know if our ghosts here go boo or if they go bah, what we do know is that legislative staff will make this building work and any other future home of the legislature. We will continue a legacy of legislative staff service that extends back to 1796, to before there was a state of Tennessee, to before the first General Assembly convened. No matter the city, no matter the capital, no matter the legislative office building, we will maintain a legacy of service that continues up to this day, up to this time. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my time. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your service to the state of Tennessee.